In 1980, George Jones recorded "He Stopped Loving Her Today," widely considered the greatest country song of all time. His voice was pure, emotional, and technically flawless. But just months before this career-defining moment, Jones couldn't even remember his own lyrics, was drinking cologne to feed his addiction, and was speaking to people as his bizarre alter ego Deedoodle. The contrast between the perfection of his art and the chaos of his life during the late 1970s reveals a dark truth that the country music industry tried to hide. This is the story of George Jones's lost years, a period so dark that even Jones himself couldn't remember much of it. The seeds of George Jones' darkest period were planted early. Born in 1931 in Saratoga, Texas, Jones grew up with an alcoholic father whose violent tendencies seemed to foreshadow Jones' own struggles. Jones began drinking early in his career, but for years he managed to function despite his growing dependence. Everything changed when he met and married Tammy Wynette in 1969. Their relationship was passionate but volatile from the start, with Jones's drinking escalating dramatically. "George was the sweetest man you could know when he was sober," Wynette once said. But when he drank, he turned into someone else entirely. By 1973, Jones' drinking had become so problematic that Wynette hid his car keys to prevent him from buying alcohol. This led to the infamous incident of Jones riding a lawnmower to the nearest liquor store, often told as a humorous anecdote, but actually a sign of serious addiction. The breakdown arrived in 1975 when Wynette filed for divorce. The end of their marriage sent Jones into a tailspin. His drinking, already problematic, became catastrophic. He began missing more shows, earning the nickname No-Show Jones. By 1976, Jones had entered his lost years. His drinking had progressed beyond simple alcoholism. He began mixing alcohol with cocaine and prescription pills, creating a dangerous cocktail that further distorted his already fragile mental state. It was during this time that the truly bizarre behavior began. Behavior that went far beyond missing shows or forgetting lyrics. The late 1970s produced a collection of George Jones stories so outlandish, they'd be hard to believe if they weren't so well documented. These weren't just the antics of a drunk country singer. They were the desperate actions of a man losing his grip on reality. The lawnmower incident wasn't just a one-time occurrence. Jones himself confirmed in his autobiography that he rode lawnmowers to buy alcohol on multiple occasions after Tammy hid his car keys. "There's something about the sound of a lawnmower that makes me thirsty to this day," he later joked, masking the darkness with humor. When alcohol wasn't available, Jones resorted to drinking aftershave and cologne. His favorite was said to be Aqua Velva, chosen not for its scent, but for its high alcohol content. This wasn't just addiction, it was desperation in its purest form. During one particularly harrowing incident in 1979, Jones was found in his Nashville home, emaciated and incoherent. He weighed just 105 pounds and had been surviving on whiskey and cocaine for days. His manager rushed him to the hospital where doctors warned that he was near death. Perhaps most disturbing was Jones's tendency to speak in strange voices. Friends and bandmates reported that he would suddenly adopt different personas, the most frequent being someone he called Deedoodle, a high-pitched, childlike character who would emerge when Jones was at his most intoxicated. "It wasn't like he was joking around," recalled bassist Ron Gaddis. "It was like George wasn't there anymore, and this other person had taken over." It was frightening to witness. The no-shows became so frequent that radio DJs began joking about them on air. In Alabama, a promoter famously placed a life-size cutout of Jones on stage when he failed to appear, telling the angry crowd, "This is about all we get of George Jones these days anyway." Behind these infamous incidents was a man spiraling further into an abyss, surrounded by enablers and exploiters who saw dollar signs instead of a human being in crisis. And as Jones's behavior became more erratic, the industry's response would reveal its darkest side. Perhaps the most disturbing aspect of Jones's lost years was the emergence of Deedoodle, an alter ego that manifested during his heaviest periods of intoxication. This wasn't just a nickname or a joke, it was as if Jones's personality had fractured under the weight of his addiction. When Deedoodle emerged, Jones's voice would change to a high-pitched, childlike tone. His mannerisms would shift, and he would speak nonsensically, often for hours at a time. It wasn't George anymore, recalled steel guitarist Bobby Emmons. His eyes would change, his voice would change. It was like watching someone possessed. Jones's road manager, Pappy Daly Jr., described one particularly chilling incident. We were in a hotel room in Knoxville, and George had been drinking for days straight. Suddenly, he started talking in this weird voice, saying he was Deedoodle and that George had gone away. This went on for hours. He wouldn't respond to his own name. Psychologists who have studied Jones's case suggest that Deedoodle may have been a dissociative response to extreme stress and substance abuse, a psychological defense mechanism that allowed Jones to escape from his reality when it became too painful to bear. What makes this period even more remarkable is that Jones was still recording during these years. Sometimes he would show up to the studio so intoxicated that he couldn't stand, yet producer Billy Sherrill would somehow coax performances out of him that still showcased his remarkable vocal abilities. While George Jones was losing himself to addiction, the country music industry was finding ways to profit from his downward spiral. Record executives, promoters, and managers who should have intervened instead created a system that enabled and exploited his condition. Despite his unreliability, Jones remained a valuable commodity. His records still sold, and when he did manage to perform, tickets still moved. This created a perverse incentive structure where those around him had financial reasons to keep him functional enough to perform, but not necessarily healthy enough to address his addiction. Epic Records, Jones' label during this period, continued to schedule recording sessions despite his deteriorating condition. Producer Billy Sherrill later admitted, "The label knew how bad George was, but they also knew he could still sell records. The attitude was basically, get what you can while he's still alive." Promoters developed a cynical approach to booking Jones. They would schedule him for shows knowing there was a good chance he wouldn't appear, but they'd sell tickets anyway. If Jones showed up, great. If not, they'd already collected the money and would offer only partial refunds or rain checks for future shows. It became a gamble, explained former promoter Ray Shelton. Promoters would book George at a discount because of the risk, but if he actually showed up, they'd make a killing. It was almost like betting on a horse race where the odds were against you, but the payoff was huge if you won. Even more disturbing was the network of enablers who surrounded Jones on the road. These individuals, some on his payroll, others just hangers-on, ensured that Jones always had access to alcohol and drugs, keeping him in a perpetual state of addiction. There were people whose entire job was to make sure George had what he needed to keep going, recalled bassist Ron Gaddis. They weren't friends, they were suppliers. They kept him just functional enough to get on stage, collect a paycheck, and do it all again the next night. By 1979, Jones's health was deteriorating rapidly. He had developed pneumonia multiple times from passing out outdoors in cold weather. His weight had dropped dangerously low. He was experiencing hallucinations and paranoia. Yet the machine around him kept pushing, extracting what value they could from a man who was clearly dying before their eyes. It would take Jones reaching absolute rock bottom before anyone would finally intervene in a meaningful way. By late 1979, George Jones had reached what he would later call the bottom of the bottom. His physical and mental health had deteriorated to a point where death seemed not just possible, but imminent. In his autobiography, I Live to Tell It All, Jones described this period with brutal honesty. "I was crazy. I was capable of doing anything. I was out of my mind." The most harrowing incident came in December 1979. After a multi-day binge, Jones was found in his Nashville home by his manager, barely conscious and severely malnourished. He weighed just 105 pounds on his 5'11" frame. His skin was yellow from liver damage. "I thought he was dead when we found him," his manager later recalled. "He was barely breathing." Jones was rushed to the hospital where doctors told him bluntly that he was dying. His liver was failing, his heart was damaged, and his mental state was severely compromised. The doctors gave him a stark choice: stop drinking or die within months. During this period, Jones's paranoia reached new heights. He began carrying a pistol and would sometimes fire it at imagined intruders or at the television. Friends reported finding bullet holes in the walls of his homes and hotel rooms. His performances, when he managed to show up at all, had become painful to watch. There were nights when he couldn't remember the lyrics to songs he'd been singing for decades. By early 1980, Jones had hit rock bottom. He was broke despite decades of success, his health was shattered, and his reputation was in tatters. Yet somehow, from this lowest point, George Jones would find a path back. What makes George Jones's lost years even more remarkable is that during this period of profound personal darkness, he somehow managed to create some of the most powerful recordings of his career. The contrast between his personal chaos and his artistic achievement is nothing short of astonishing. In 1980, at the very nadir of his addiction, Jones recorded "He Stopped Loving Her Today," a song that would not only revive his career but would eventually be voted the greatest country song of all time by numerous polls and publications. The recording sessions for this masterpiece were notoriously difficult. Producer Billy Sherrill later revealed that it took more than a year to complete the song due to Jones's condition. Sometimes he was too drunk to stand up, Sherrill recalled. We'd prop him up at the microphone and get a line or two at a time. Other days, he'd forget what we were working on entirely. Jones himself initially hated the song, telling Sherrill, "Nobody will buy that morbid son of a bitch." He was so resistant to recording it that Sherrill had to piece together the final version from multiple sessions, sometimes recording the same line dozens of times to get a usable take. Yet the result was transcendent. Jones's voice, ravaged by alcohol and drugs, conveyed a depth of pain and loss that perfectly matched the song's tragic narrative. The very brokenness that was destroying him personally somehow enhanced his artistic expression. Music critic Bill Friskix Warren wrote, "The miracle of He Stopped Loving Her Today is that Jones, at his lowest point as a human being, delivered a performance of such clarity and emotional truth. It's as if his suffering had stripped away everything but the essential core of his artistry." Other recordings from this period, including "These Days I Barely Get By" and "If Drinkin' Don't Kill Me, Her Memory Will," similarly transformed Jones's personal anguish into art. These weren't just songs, they were confessions, raw and unfiltered expressions of a man in the grip of addiction and despair. The irony wasn't lost on Jones. Years later, when sober, he reflected, "The songs that saved my career were about the very things that were destroying my life. I was singing my own obituary, and I didn't even realize it." This paradox that Jones's greatest artistic triumphs came during his period of greatest personal failure remains one of the most fascinating aspects of his legacy. It raises profound questions about the relationship between suffering and art, and about the price some artists pay for their greatest work. After years of spiraling deeper into addiction, George Jones finally found his turning point in early 1980, but it didn't come easily, and it didn't come alone. The catalyst for change arrived in the form of Nancy Sepulvado, a woman Jones met on a blind date arranged by his manager. Unlike many in Jones's orbit, Nancy wasn't impressed by his celebrity status and wasn't willing to enable his self-destructive behavior. "When I met George, he was a wreck," Nancy later recalled. "He was drinking constantly, he was thin as a rail, and he could barely function. But I saw something in him worth saving." Their first date was hardly romantic. Jones was so intoxicated that he could barely hold a conversation. Most women would have walked away, but Nancy saw through the addiction to the man beneath. "I told him straight out that he was killing himself," she said, "and I told him I wouldn't stick around to watch it happen." The success of He Stopped Loving Her Today provided additional motivation. Released in April 1980, the song quickly climbed the charts, eventually reaching #1 and reigniting interest in Jones's career. In late 1980, after another relapse and hospitalization, Jones finally agreed to enter a serious treatment program. With Nancy's support, he checked into a rehabilitation facility in Alabama, where he spent 30 days confronting his addiction. Nancy, who would become his wife in 1983, provided the stability Jones had never had. She took over managing his career and his finances, implementing strict rules to keep him away from the enablers who had surrounded him for years. "She saved my life, no question about it," Jones would later say. "Without Nancy, I'd be dead." The lost years of George Jones cast a long shadow over his legacy, but they also helped create the legend that endures today. The man who emerged from that darkness wasn't just a survivor. He became a symbol of redemption that resonated far beyond country music. After getting sober, Jones experienced a career renaissance that lasted well into his later years. He continued to record and perform until shortly before his death in 2013 at the age of 81. The stories from his darkest period became part of country music folklore, cautionary tales told with a mixture of shock and reverence. The lawnmower incident, in particular, has been referenced in songs, jokes, and even commemorated with a lawnmower statue at the George Jones Museum in Nashville. Jones himself came to address this period with remarkable candor. In his 1996 autobiography and in numerous interviews, he spoke openly about his addiction and the damage it had caused. "I'm not proud of those years," he told an interviewer in 2010, "but I don't hide from them either. If my story keeps one person from going down that same road, then maybe all that suffering had some purpose." The music from Jones's lost years has taken on additional resonance with time. Songs like "He Stopped Loving Her Today" are now understood not just as great country songs, but as documents of a man fighting for his life through his art. Today, George Jones is remembered not just for his remarkable voice, but for his remarkable journey, from the depths of addiction to redemption and artistic triumph. The story of George Jones's lost years is ultimately about the resilience of the human spirit. It's about a man who descended into a darkness so complete that it nearly consumed him, yet somehow found his way back to the light. What makes Jones's story so powerful is that he didn't just survive. He emerged from his ordeal with his artistry not just intact, but enhanced. The pain and struggle of those years gave his voice a depth and authenticity that connected with listeners on a profound level. When we listen to recordings like "He Stopped Loving Her Today," we're hearing more than just a great country song. We're hearing the voice of a man who had stared into the abyss and lived to sing about it. The emotion in those performances isn't manufactured. It's the real product of real suffering. Jones never pretended that his recovery was perfect. He experienced relapses over the years, though none as severe as his darkest period. He spoke openly about the daily struggle of maintaining sobriety and rebuilding the relationships his addiction had damaged. "Getting sober wasn't the end of the story," he once said. "It was just the beginning of a different one." In the years following his recovery, Jones became an elder statesman of country music, respected not just for his talent, but for his honesty about his flaws. Younger artists sought his mentorship, and many credited him with helping them avoid the pitfalls that had nearly destroyed him. The country music industry, too, was forced to reckon with its role in enabling and exploiting artists with addiction issues. While problems certainly remain, the blatant exploitation that characterized Jones's lost years would be much harder to justify today. Perhaps the most important lesson from George Jones's story is that it's never too late for redemption. After years of self-destruction, after countless burned bridges and squandered opportunities, Jones found a way back. He not only salvaged his career, but created some of his most enduring work in the years that followed his darkest period. In the end, the lost years of George Jones weren't truly lost at all. They were painful, they were destructive, but they were also transformative. They shaped the man and the artist he would become, and they gave his music a depth and resonance it might otherwise have lacked. The voice that emerged from that darkness wasn't just country music's greatest. It was one of its most honest, most human, and most enduring.